Good afternoon. This is the Real Thomas Jefferson, episode 10. Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. This is based on the Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello's report of the Committee on Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings and its findings. In January of 2000, Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello released a report of the Committee on Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. According to the TJF, from December 1998 to April 1999, the committee analyzed the 1998 DNA study featured in the journal Nature. Relevant documentary historical information was also evaluated. Committee members were appointed by then president of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. They consisted of nine members, plus the Monticello director of special programs, the latter of whom chaired the committee. 4 PhDs, a medical doctor, and other experts were involved in the study. Other participants represented the fields of communications, archaeology, education, research, and history and historical interpretation. Monticello's advisory committee for the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies and Advisory Committee on African American Interpretation provided unique expertise and advice. This episode highlights and discusses in detail the methodology and the results of the committee's findings. The committee's minority dissenting opinion is also examined. We will address specifically the committee's charge and overview, assessment of the DNA study, review and documentary sources, research findings and implications, and assessment of possible paternity of other Jeffersons. And then we will conclude. Finally, for our listeners, consider that the committee report remains the single most resource for Jefferson for many researchers. If the study is biased in any way, then so are the scholarly narratives on Thomas Jefferson that have relied upon it. And with that background, we would like, again, this is the Real Thomas Jefferson 8, episode 10. We would like to begin with question number 1.
Okay. I already have my pointy thing again in advance, and this again, no one's ever commented. It matches my shirt, pink. Okay. Anyways, but I mean, I'll start off with a little story. Dave and I don't know, about a year and a half ago, went to Monticello, and we're walking around. I found the whole episode very nerve-wracking because I could just feel the tension. I could just feel the ghost of Thomas Jefferson walking around and disliking everything going on there. And we stopped to overhear one of the young male tour guides speak, and he was talking in a manner that just reflected that rehashed the narrative of 1873 Madison Hemings. It's everything that supposedly Jefferson's son here, had said. The person on the committee was just repeating as if it was gospel. So I sort of disagreed with that loudly, and I, made some comments, and there was a large commotion by the people, and they said, hey, we don't want you to hear what you have to say. And the tour guy said, no, let him speak. He goes, he apparently has never read the 2000 Thomas Jefferson Foundation's report, to which I retorted, I've not only read it, I've destroyed it. Well, whether I did or not, that's a matter for people to decide. But it reinforces the point that David made, a very, very, very important point. If there's any cozenage, any misleading going on at Monticello, it's affecting tremendously scholars all over the world. That's why it's important to talk about this. And that's up to you, Donna. You're
My turn? Okay. Question number 1. So we're going to proceed piecemeal and seriatim. What can we say of the committee?
I like that word, by the way, seriatim.
Yeah, it's a neat sounding word.
Is that a daughter of John Adams? Seriatim? Bad joke, right? It's not even funny. My jokes are really good because they're so unfunny. I don't even know if unfunny is a word. They're
That
so
makes it
unfunny.
funny though.
You sit back and start laughing because you say that really was terrible, right?
Oh, yeah. What can we say of the committee?
You want to hear my
formed-
Leon? I'll give you my example. My Leon Rhymes joke. Leon Rhymes? No, it doesn't. Okay, go ahead. Sorry. Not funny.
Okay. I'm afraid, I'm afraid to start speaking. Okay. What can we say of the committee formed to assess Thomas Jefferson's possible paternity?
Well,
Tell us
in
about that
my
committee.
estimation, it is a sort of a mishmash of people. Dave talked about their qualifications. There was Diane Swan Wright, who was the overseer, the chair. Her expertise was in racial studies. Whitney Espich, communications officer. Fraser Neiman, director of archaeology. Ann Porter, educational instructor. And Lucia Stanton, a research historian. She's a pretty good historian. Elizabeth Dowling Taylor, head guide. White Mackenzie Wallingford, one of my dear friends. He was a former member of the School of Medicine at UVA. He's retired, but he was highly qualified to be a member of the committee. And Camille Wells, director of research. So it's a sort of hodgepodge. And one could say that by looking at the qualifications of those on the committee, one wonders why there weren't more people directly involved who have expertise in DNA or biology, things like that. That's one of the things.
Right, right. So what should, if we're looking at, in your opinion, when you're looking at paternity, DNA paternity testing, what would a qualified individual look like to
Well,
you?
you're gonna want different, to me, I don't know, you're gonna want people who know something about, the DNA, because the whole thing was incited by the DNA. My cat's caterwauling because he wants to go outside and it's raining and cold. But anyways, you want people that are qualified to speak on DNA. And they did do that. They did get a subcommittee. I mean, they had their committee. They said they met 10 times within the course of a year or so. They had an advisory committee from the Smith Center, the Thomas Jefferson Smith Center behind, where you have a variety of Jeffersonian scholars or early American scholars that go. I've never been invited over my years. And then they had an African-American interpretation committee. Again, I sort of question the relevance of that, because why do we need a committee that focuses on race when we're just looking at DNA specifically?
Right, right.
So I don't know why that was necessary. But I do point out, and let me do screen sharing here. Coincident with the study, or before the study, let me bring this up on, let me just do one page here, sorry. We can see that there was, I was looking at this, and a book was published prior to the results come out. And the book was titled, you guys can see that, right? It's titled Thomas Jefferson, History, Memory, and Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson, History, Memory, and Civic Culture, and put out by John Lewis and Peter Onuf. And the chair of the committee, of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Committee, submits an article. This is a collection of essays that is meant to explore the implications of Thomas Jefferson's possible putative affair with Sally Hemings. So they're already, what this suggests to me, and I qualify that to me, is that some of the people, it begs the question, are at least some of the people on the committee committed to there being a relationship, an affair, without the evidence being thoroughly examined? So, I leave that up. I leave that open for question, and I'm going to read from that. We close that up, and I'll read from a review of the book, which they say the DNA test would not have been conducted had there not already been strong historical evidence for the possibility of a relationship. Now, what do you mean by strong historical evidence? We looked at the DNA last time, and what did we get, Dave? What did we learn from the DNA?
A lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, Jefferson could be the father of Eston. None of the other children were tested, right? And so they say, as historians from Winthrop D. Jordan to Annette Gordon Reed have argued, much more is at stake in this liaison than the mere question of paternity. Much more is at stake. They're already looking beyond the paternity. What can we do with this? Right? If we get our results, historians must ask themselves if they're prepared to accept the full implications of our complicated racial history, a history powerfully shaped by the institution of slavery and by sex across the color line. How does it change our understanding of American history to place Thomas Jefferson in his social context as a plantation owner who fathered white and black families, both? Right? The question itself, this is before the study's even done. They're talking about Jefferson being father to white and black children prior to their results coming out. Right? It annoys me. What happens when we shift our focus from Jefferson and his white family to Sally Hemings and her children? How do we understand how do we understand interracial sexual relationships in the early republic in our own time? And so forth. They ask another question. But I mean, it's sort of outlandish that these people are already, one of the most prominent person on the committee has submitted an article to this collection of essays. That begs the question whether the person overseeing the committee has a dispassionate, does the person have some political interest outside of this or not? That question must be asked. That's all I want to say with that. So I just found it interesting that ONIF comes out with this book, prior to the evidence coming out. Now, I have included, I don't know if you guys have the script. They had subcommittees, Kenneth Kidd, genetics, Yale, right? This is what, Donna, answering your question. Mark Lavelle, molecular biology, UVA, and David Page, who does genome research at MIT. So they did get some highly qualified, right? And Donna, do you have the stuff in front of you? Could you read what Kenneth Kidd writes? They're paraphrasing Kenneth.
Kenneth Kidd. Wait, which
under question 2, right under question.
Oh, okay. That's okay. I think Eric Lander and Joseph Ellis in their News and Views commentary overinterpreted the results as proving that Jefferson was the father of Eston. I think the actual authors are more correct when they consider other explanations unlikely.
Keep going too. One more.
Okay. I personally think the simplest answer is that Jefferson was the father of Eston. He may have been the father of all of Sally Hemings' children except Thomas Woodson, and she may have thought that Jefferson was the father of Thomas Woodson as well.
I always, as an analytic philosopher, I always love to pick out words and understand what a sentence literally implies or means. The simplest answer. What does it mean to be the simplest answer? I've argued in my book, Framing a Legend, that by simplest answer, they mean historically most convenient. If we just implicate Thomas Jefferson in paternity, we don't have to do any more work. We're done. Right? He lived at Monticello. He probably did it. And my argument might be that I will concede you that Jefferson is likely the most probable candidate for paternity, but that does not imply that he was likely the father of any of the children. And I argue from the fact that when I roll a pair of dice, and what's the most probable outcome with 2 dice? 7. There's a 1 in 6 chance. That's the most probable outcome. But at 1 in 6, would you bet on that? No. So I think Jefferson is the most likely candidate in that sense. He lived at Monticello, and he, it's very easy to say, okay, if we just implicate Jefferson, we don't have to do any digging. But we have other evidence, as we're going to see, namely primary source material that puts his brother Randolph at the scene of the crime at Monticello, right? Often among the slaves' quarters, singing and dancing. And we can't just ignore that. So we have There are also, David Page from MIT talks about that the study would have been better if they did bookkeeping in the interpretation of the results. He says bookkeeping is worrying about a mistake, such as mixing up the test tubes that could have led to a significant match. He would feel better if blood was redrawn from Eston descendant and retyped. In other words, they did one sample from a descendant of Eston, got the results they want, and they stopped doing research. Why not do more samples from other descendants or another sample? And he says, it would have been better if someone oversaw what the research is doing. What if there's a mix-up with the test tubes or something? Highly improbable, but still possible. So he's talking about the implications of the manner in which, his overall thing is that the study was probably conducted, rightly, and the results legitimate, but more material would have been helpful. So I think that's very, very interesting.
One of the things that's kind of interesting to me about that comment that was made by the scientist, that it's
I got to let my cat out. Go ahead.
The easiest explanation, that simplest explanation. Is that something he was stating, or was that something he also believed himself? Because that strongly implies Occam's razor, not inference to the best explanation, IBE, which is the cornerstone of scientific methodology.
Well, I like
sometimes the answer is the simplest, but sometimes it's not.
Yeah, and I like to call it Aristotle's razor, by the way, because Aristotle made that point before
exactly.
Occam.
Yep. Well, there wasn't anything else to do, I guess, in the 12th century than copy Aristotle.
Well, I kind of break it down to something a little more simple. If I pose this to men, especially because you're the ones that don't know, whereas a woman knows she's pregnant. But if someone came to you and said, genetics DNA tests show that you're the father, and you wanted to question that, think about, are you willing to just pay child support and financially be responsible for this child? Or would you want more involved evidence if you're going to have that financial obligation for 20 plus years? So we need to really think about.
Well, the point is in your case is, when you're asking about whether someone's the father of a woman's child, the person knows who did it. And if the person's not the father, well, I can't say that. But there are probably instances where a woman is involved with many men at the same time, and she's implicating one guy.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't know.
As a man, you would want more. I would suspect you would want the most accurate evidence possible. That's why we shouldn't just accept, okay, we have Jefferson DNA, but we shouldn't just assume. That's what the problem with assuming, okay, well, if it's Jefferson DNA, it has to be Jefferson. Well, there were many other male Jeffersons alive at that time. So if you personally, or any man, if a woman is going to say you're the father and now going to be financially responsible for this child, would you want just that? Would that be acceptable to you? Or would you want specific genetic testing done that actually shows it is you that's the father? Or would you be satisfied with, okay, it's your bloodline, but you had a brother that could have been messing around?
Yeah.
With the woman.
But it brings to bear, the sincerity of some of the research of some of the historians. Joe Ellis, for example, who wrote those articles about which David talked, he wrote an article in the Nature implicating Jefferson and declaring Jefferson was the father of Sally Hemings' kids. Before that, he didn't think Jefferson was the father, and now he does, and he's made a reputation on that. He writes, I like this, he goes, Randolph, talking about Jefferson's brother is brought forward now because he fits the genetic profile. Historians of the lost cause syndrome will recognize the poignant fusion of sincerity and futility at work here. Mainly, Ellis is saying that any historian who puts forth Randolph is really behaving insincerely, right? I'll put up Ellis's quote. It's an act of great insincerity, the poignant fusion of sincerity and futility. It's lost cause historical research. It's not lost cause, Joe. Say it ain't so, Joe. Here, the problem, Joe, where you're wrong is the Y chromosome is consistent with Randolph being the father. It's consistent with a number of other male Jeffersons. And you can't just, as Donna was saying,
that's my point.
Just say it's simplest. It's because we don't have to do any work. But if you want to do history the right way, you do the digging. You investigate the possibility of Randolph or any of his kids being the father. You can't assume. They're assuming. And I make a very important point here, is that no harm done. You might say, who cares? There is harm done. The people at Monticello have convinced so many offspring of Sally Hemings' children, that they're all fathered, that Jefferson is in their lineage. I don't think Jefferson ever had an affair with Sally Hemings. If I'm right, then what are you doing telling all these people that Jefferson is in their lineage? You have no right to do that until you know. And
well, the biggest issue I have is the discrediting our founding. That's my issue with if this turns out that it is not true, the damage it has done to the way the younger generation feels about America, because they've been brainwashed to believe this.
Yeah, and think about that. Add to that, people always, well, why do scholars, when they attack the founders, attack Jefferson most violently? And I think that's probably the case. It's because he is, in my estimation, the greatest figure among the founding fathers.
If he is. He wrote the Declaration of Independence.
Well, he did 1,000 things other than that. To me, that just became by accident a great document. It is a great document, but he was just a great man. If he never written that, he would probably, in my estimation, be still considered the greatest founding father from all the other things that he did. And we even mentioned
as president of the United States, he ended the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah. Well, he did a lot. We talked about what he did to try to work against the slave trade. So this is really kind of a stupid quote by Joe Ellis. There's a lot of that.
Would you go back to that quote for a second, please?
You're making me work here, Dave.
Sorry. Just a comment.
All right. Got it?
I don't know whether this is by pure accident or coincidence or a deliberate suggestion, but it's really interesting here, the words that historians of the lost cause syndrome.
Sure.
There's a tie-in between what people who are apparently disagreeing with the foundation and other assessments that are like that they are the equivalent in that context to the Southerners in the post-Civil War era that claimed that, we could have won this war had we stayed a little bit longer, that kind of thing. It's really quite interesting.
Well, it just goes to show you the politicking that goes on when they do. This is not legitimate history to bring in lost cause, right?
And that's why I'm bringing this up, is there's a subtlety there. And to his credit, he may not intended that to be.
Oh, he did intend it.
I don't know what was going through his mind.
He did intend it. I know the guy. The point, in analytic philosophy, there's something called in words, there's connotation and denotation. Connotation literally means what a word means, the definition of something. Denotation is what it points to, right? My dog, and I point to Jefferson here on my desk. And then there's emotive content. And, there's a sort of a stoical point, but it ties into emotive content is something that terms or words call to mind emotionally. And people use those with intention to get your emotions rallied up or stirred so you feel a particular way. And the lost cause syndrome, he's doing that intentionally. Same thing the way Winsack writes his book on Jefferson. It's cloudy outside. I'm at Monticello. And then I realized what a real son of a bitch Jefferson was. Well, he's talking about the cloudiness and he's just trying to get you emotionally ready. Historians don't have any business, in my estimation, of dealing with emotions and metaphors and all this. Just tell us what happened. Suggest causal links of what, and then suggest what the implications are for us, but don't do history that way. So that's a good point you made.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Let me,
That's to me, that was always a sure sign when I was in graduate school that I would just stop. The credibility was lost on historians who did that. Because I thought if you're trying, you write for there are three reasons, and we teach this in second grade. You write to entertain, persuade, or inform. So, and if I feel like a writer is writing to persuade me when it's supposed to be something that's just factual information given to me, then I know there's a different motive there. So
one can persuade in two ways. One can persuade by presenting good, sound, cogent, or sound arguments in deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning, cogent arguments. That's what it's supposed to be about, presenting evidence and arguments. Once you start bringing in lost cause syndrome, you're getting away from that. You're trying to bully people emotionally into believing in what you have to say. And that's what's at stake here. When we talk about the Thomas Jefferson Foundation trial, are they really interested in getting at the truth of what's going on? Or are they cherry picking or trying to create a story for a political reason? That's what we're trying to ascertain here. I think we can work on. So today we're gonna talk about the documentary sources. The next question, Donna, and all of us can talk about this. And then next time we're going to talk about, in the next time we do this 2 weeks from now, we'll talk about what the Thomas Jefferson Foundation concludes.
Okay. Okay. So are we? I think you answered
question 3.
Okay, 2. Yeah.
I danced around 2, by the way.
Yeah. What can be said of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation's review of documentary sources?
Well, let me preface that. I have screen sharing up. We talk about the children of Sally Hemings. We see the possible children. Thomas Woodson, who claimed he was a descendant of this first Thomas that Jefferson impregnated Sally Hemings in France. There's no DNA evidence to suggest that's true. I crossed that out. I think that's just a fabrication. I don't think she ever got pregnant. I think that's just part of the 1873 narrative by Madison Hemings, one of the children of Sally. That's just false. But we do know they had Harriet, Beverly, possibly another. The first Harriet dies young. So we have Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston. We only have DNA test, one sample from Eston. We've never done any physical evidence. We have no physical evidence of, we don't even know what happened to Beverly and Harriet, so we can't get their descendants. Madison, right? Yeah, but that's all we looked at. So the Monticello, I wrote my book, my last book on Jefferson Hemings, and I weighed all the evidence pro-paternity and all the evidence against paternity. And the pro-paternity thesis, to me, was the thesis because that's what they make it. Thomas Jefferson fathered all the children. So that's the hypothesis that I entertain, that I state that they entertain because they literally entertain it. Is that true? Takes very little to refute that. All we need is evidence that Jefferson didn't father one of the kids, and that. But then again, if we do that, it still might be the case that Jefferson fathered Eston. So they look at Callender's testimony in 1802, this letter to Robert Smith, which I'll talk about in a bit. I'll bring this up and we can all. 1850s, Jefferson's friends, John Hartwell Cock, expresses his belief, this is from their website, that the relationship many years after Jefferson's death, and I'll read, I went to what Cox said in his journal, his diary. It is too well known that they are not few nor far between. Were they enumerated with the statistics of the state, they would be found by hundreds, nor is it to be wondered at when Mr. Jefferson's notorious example is to be considered. The idea is what he's talking about, the instances, he's talking about instances of a master of an estate, a plantation owner, having sex with one of his slaves. Second quote, he writes in his journal, all bachelors, or a large majority at least, keep as a substitute for a wife some individual of their own slaves. In Virginia, this damnable practice prevails as much as anywhere, and probably more as Mr. Jefferson's example can be pleaded for its defense. Now notice he starts out with all bachelors, or a large majority. Where does he get his evidence for that? Just makes it up. Has he done a survey of all plantation owners in whether they have sex? We know that was prevalent. We don't know to what extent it was. It's just impossible to get at that. So who was this guy? No, look him up. He's born in 1780. Jefferson's born what? 1743. So we can't assume an intimate friendship. And when you look him up on Wikipedia, what we find is that they had not a friendship, but an association. They both worked at getting the University of Virginia off the ground. There's no intimation at all. I haven't looked at any correspondence between them. There's no intimation that they were close. So what source does Koch have for claiming that Jefferson had sex with one of his slaves? Is he just reading what Callender wrote? We don't know. I mean, this guy is born in 1780. Jefferson's first child is what, 1780 something. So he's too young, really. The last child, Eston, is born in 1808. So he would have been 28 years old when the last child was born. He's very young at the time. More than likely, he's getting his information after the fact for some secondary source. So why is this so important to be such a consideration in their determination of Jefferson's paternity? One person has a diary that Jefferson had sex with a slave. What about the people in their diaries that we haven't examined? They talk about Jefferson never had sex with a slave. I think John Adams said that, by the way, that I stand with Jefferson. That never happened. Okay, then we go on to Jefferson's grandson. There are three versions. You know, let's just look at these since we got this up. Let's look at the slides here. Not this one here, but here's, one thing they do consider: Thomas Jefferson to Robert Smith on 1 July 1805. This is primary evidence. Jefferson writes in a cover letter to Levi Lincoln, "You'll perceive that I plead guilty to one of their charges, that when young and single offered love to a handsome lady, I acknowledge its correctness." Thomas Walker was an older friend of Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Walker went away at some time to an Indian delegation to assume a treaty or something, and not know if he's going to come back. Jefferson was a friend. He said, "Would you look after my wife and my child?" And Jefferson presumably did more than look after. Jefferson presumably made a pass at the woman. To what extent she was implicated? Could she have made a pass at him? Yeah. But what would have been the gentlemanly thing to do if she made a pass is the gentleman takes the blame. So Jefferson's admitting to having made, he says, when young, I offered love to one of their charges. He's only talking about one. By implication, this is suggesting that all the stuff that Callender said, this comes after Callender, 3 years after, it's false. Annette Gordon Reed sweeps this by saying, well, he didn't mention Sally Hemings at all, so we can't say it implies that. I disagree with that. Primary testimony, Jefferson himself speaking. Edmund Bacon, 1862, who was the overseer, talking about Harriet, one of Sally's children. She was not Jefferson's daughter. She was Blank's daughter. I know that. I've seen him come out of their mother's room many a morning when I went up to Monticello. What does the Monticello people, what do they say about that? Bacon was not employed at Monticello until 5 years after Harriet Hemings' birth. So in other words, Harriet's born in 1801. Bacon was employed in 1806, right? Now, do we know that he was employed as overseer in 1806? Do we know that he wasn't employed before that? We don't. Even assume that go ahead, Dave.
No, I agree. He may very well have been employed at a lower level.
And
yeah.
So assume that he just started working in 1806. We have evidence that he's seeing someone from 1806 onward leaving her room. Why can't, is it a big stretch to think? And it seems to suggest it's the one person, only one person. Is it a big stretch to think that this is the same person's been going there for the past 2 decades? Maybe, maybe not. But this is primary testimony. Notice how they sweep that under the rug. Then we have Abigail Adams. I like this testimony a lot. That's your girl there, Donna, Abigail. When Jefferson's in France, Mary Jefferson with Sally Hemings comes in 1787 in the summer to Jefferson in Paris. The ship stops off. I think it's the Cirrus. No, Jefferson on the Cirrus. I don't know what her ship was. Stops in England, and the Adams meet Sally Hemings and Mary Jefferson, whom Dave tells us is called Maria later, probably. And Adams says this: the girl she, in other words, Mary has with her, wants more care than the child and is wholly incapable of looking properly after her without some superior to direct her. Adams says this on 2 occasions in 2 letters. I just give you one. And if we take Abigail Adams as a sincere and honest person, what this tells us is that Sally Hemings, who was 14 at the time, Mary's 8, is behaving at a maturation level less than Mary, who was 8 at the time. Are you going to tell me that Jefferson sees this gal who's cute at 14 but behaves like a 7-year-old, and he falls inescapably in love with her? Too much for me to buy. Right? Any other comments on that one? I find that funny, laughable. And then the last one is Isaac Jefferson, who was a slave at Monticello in 1847. In one of his testimonies, he says, "Old master's brother, Mass Randolph, was a mighty simple man, used to come out among black people, play the fiddle and dance half the night, had much more sense than Isaac." This puts Thomas Jefferson's brother at Mulberry Road often, right? And if we want to talk about the coincidence of every time Sally Hemings got pregnant, Jefferson was there roughly 9 months before that. How do we know Randolph, who lived 20 miles away south, wasn't there too? Right? He was highly dependent on his brother, and it's not unlikely that he would come to visit whenever he had a chance to see his brother. Yeah. Right? So this puts Randolph at the scene of the crime and explains a lot. So, I mean, these are 4 bits of direct testimony. Monticello does not do much with any of them. I mean, excuse me. Edmund